Go Cubs! Go Cubs! Go Cubs! Good morning. This is Viewpoint, a program of personalities, sports fans, and politicians, and perspectives. And we certainly have an interesting personality this morning, and going to find out something about engineering. And we'll have Judy make the official introduction very shortly. We always, Mr. Forgy, we always try to start Viewpoint with a kudo or two. And down through the years, there have been many, many, many long-suffering Cubs fans. So we'll just shout for the kudos for the Cubs fans who have stuck with them so far and may or may not get to see them go any further. So that's very simple. Kudos.
Well, in this territory where we live here in central Illinois, there are some who are very happy and there are some who aren't very happy.
I think this is primarily Cardinal country here for the most part. But there are a few of us diehards who don't know any better, who were born Cub fans and have stayed that way because their daddies were. Anyway, we'll see what happens in the next go around there. I've even forgotten who we play at this point in time. It'll be told to me.
They don't know yet.
Oh, yeah, that's the way it goes. Okay, all right. Why don't we introduce
They're going to tell you when
Let's get right down to serious.
The game is won.
Let's get down to serious business.
Well, this is going to be very interesting because...
Well, it is to you and I.
Yes, because you're the first engineer I've ever known, I think, Darren. And I always knew
about Casey?
That you... Casey Jones, yes, he was an engineer. Yes, he was, a different kind of engineer. Well, there are myriad kinds of engineers. My golly. Yes, for sure. And you are Prairie engineers, and come to find out in reading your literature here, I thought that I just would call your outfit if Bill and I had a squabble and I thought his fence was on my yard or something. Well, little did I know that there's just all kinds of stuff, and you have to know the law inside out.
The boundary law in Illinois, yes, or in whatever state you're working in, and it can also vary quite a bit from community to community or county to county as well. So,
if I may interrupt, you didn't tell the folks who this good gentleman is.
I said Darren. I forgot about the Forgy part.
Oh yeah, that's kind of important to him.
Well, I did say Prairie engineers. That was important to him. Yes. Well, you're working on all kinds of projects for the Department of Transportation, IDOT.
Oh yes. Yeah.
And we've talked so much lately, not Bill and I, but the world has talked about the infrastructure. And that requires an engineer to fix the bridge, for instance, that's over the I-270 Mississippi River Bridge, for instance. Yep. The engineer has to figure out all the rules and regulations and how to make that bridge stand for a lot of years.
There is a lot that goes into that, and just to be, just to disclose everything, we're doing a small part of a lot of the projects that I've given to you and shown that we do. Prairie engineers, we do very few bridges because there's a specialty subset of civil engineering in Illinois, structural engineering, and it's a separate license that we don't have. However, like for example, you mentioned the Interstate I-270 bridge over the Mississippi River down by St. Louis.
Right.
We are working on that project for the Illinois Department of Transportation. We have some design of the roadways approaching that bridge. We help set the elevations. We look at the impacts to the community on either side of because they're going to build an entirely new bridge there. So that moving it 100 feet in either direction at the end of the bridge makes a humongous difference to the people who are living beside it. And we do a lot of those environmental impact analysis for projects like that.
Maybe you could kind of walk us through an imaginary scenario where the engineers come into play. For instance, we had to protect the spotted owl. We had to protect the snail darter. Now,
don't forget the one-eyed tsetse fly.
And all that and that too. But you have to get engineers who have to know what we have to protect and how you go about and the trade-offs and the things with the law.
Well, most of the projects, especially transportation projects, but really most government projects, whether they are funded by or whether they are undertaken by a local government, a state government, or the federal government, most of the times have a component that's of federal funding. And really, it's the federal funding that brings in all those requirements. So, for example, every project that has even $1 of federal funds somewhere in it has to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And that's, you're talking about the endangered species like Indiana brown bat or the, snail darter, Franklin ground squirrel. And we have to look, we do what they call a NEPA document, and there's several different levels of it, but as part of the planning of a project up front, before any engineering design is ever done, every project is looked at and say, okay, well, we want to put a new road across this wetland. What is the impact of that wetland? Sometimes it's not a great impact and there's really very little that has to be done. You build it. Sometimes there is a lot of impact and maybe we'll need to build some new wetlands somewhere else to compensate or mitigate for that loss. So engineers have to be knowledgeable about the laws of the federal government and the acts. And we also have, for example, Prairie Engineers has a staff of environmental scientists that we rely on to help us through some of the fine points of that.
Right. Yeah, I want to just get to the economics of it insofar as the community is concerned. It's kind of a sleeper profession insofar as the general public is concerned. And in fact, you have quite a few employees. And there's an economic impact in our community, too.
Absolutely.
And not only that, but you have other offices.
Yes, we do. Prairie Engineers currently has 17 employees. It fluctuates a little bit depending on, in the summer months, we usually hire a few interns in town, and we have been a growing company. I mean, it started out in 2010 with my wife, Lisa Kramer, who's also an engineer. She founded the firm out of our house. It was a way for her at the time to spend more time at home with the kids and work part-time, and had some success in gaining clients and jobs, and a year later I joined her. She had enough success and we've grown from there to 17 people. Typically engineering jobs do pay pretty well as far as the community goes. A typical entry-level engineer probably makes somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 or $45,000, something like that as a graduate from college. And even the technical employees that may not have an engineering degree do fairly well in the grand scheme of things.
Let's talk a little bit about the high-speed rail. You've been involved with that, and surely as it goes from state to state, that must make things even more complicated.
Well, right now, the high-speed rail project is isolated to Illinois for this. There are other high-speed rail projects going on the eastern seaboard and out in California, but most of the adjacent states have turned back the federal funds because of all the requirements you talked about, and politics. A lot of our adjacent states had Republican governors that said we don't want those money, and those federal monies then a lot of times came to Illinois, and they moved the project forward here. It's running, from just south of Chicago to St. Louis, just not going into St. Louis. The Illinois Department of Transportation is stopping short of the river crossing with the improvements. But yes, we've been involved.
You might know Illinois would buy into it.
Absolutely.
That's the Illinois
We do things differently.
The idea was that there'd be a high-speed rail network that had a hub in Chicago. There were several identified nationally. The eastern seaboard would all be connected by high-speed rail. The western coast, especially California, would be connected, and there'd be another network centered around Chicago. And it was supposed to reach out to the Des Moines, Iowa, and the Madison, Wisconsin, and those places are served by the rail network now, but they're just looking for more reliability and a little bit faster, make it a more viable option. And the idea behind it is that they could potentially spend less in other transportation areas, like building more lanes on an interstate, if more people took the transit or the rail.
Well, the bottom line on that, in my personal take, is that for the monies that, and there's a humongous amount of money being spent on this project. Just look in Logan County alone, let alone the rest up and down the right of way. How much are they going to save between Chicago and St. Louis? At 45 minutes or an hour or so? Who cares? I mean, you know, there's a practicality issue there for this old farm boy.
I don't believe you're the only one that has that opinion.
Yeah, really.
Well, I look at the monies being spent just on the fencing alone. I've commented about this before up here in these various communities. That's an incredible amount of money.
It is an incredible expense. There's no doubt about it, and it's probably larger than you could imagine. You really want to get down to it.
I bet it is.
There are some positive impacts that come to the community. Obviously, right now, there's a lot of jobs in our community just from everybody staying here. I'm sure the hotels and restaurants are more full because of it. Went down and had lunch yesterday in Elkhart, and there's a whole line of trucks parked in front of the talk of the town. You know,
sure.
And a lot of the contractors.
Let's get to your background. Did Mrs. Forgy is a licensed engineer, and did you meet on the University of Illinois campus?
No, we didn't actually. We met afterwards in the engineering community. We both graduated and went to work in Springfield, Illinois for different firms, and we met. We were both very active in professional societies down there, and that's how we met. Yeah.
One of your projects that you've been involved in is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I want to tell you this word, okay? It's about 6 inches long here. Hydrogeomorphological evaluation of the lower Missouri River.
Yep.
I'm
Hydrogeomorphological evaluation. Yeah. HGM for short. Everybody calls it HGM studies, but I want to give you the real name for it. Essentially, what that is it's a project where they're looking at ways to restore the functionality of the Missouri River from a environmental standpoint. There's a lot of endangered species, like pallid sturgeon, or a lot of fish species, a lot of wetland wildlife species along that corridor, and really our large rivers have been channelized to a large extent to accommodate barge traffic. And, so they're looking at ways to restore the environmental functionality and to stop, frankly, a lot of the erosion or our rivers are very muddy.
Yeah,
so
they are. You should see the Mississippi up north. It's beautiful. Yes. I mean, like northern Minnesota.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but it sure gets fouled up before it gets here.
What we do is we look at the history of the river, and we go back and look at any records that are available, going back to, like we talked about, land surveying. The original government land surveys in the area had, when they set section corners, they had ties to bearing trees, and there's notes by those surveyors in the 1830s or 1840s that say this was a 16-inch black cherry tree. So they can look at those and map out and say, well, this area was, they can say this species, a cottonwood or a willow tree, was very predominant here, so this was a wetland area, and this area wasn't, and other, there's lots of other mapping they can do, but they can see where the river was, and they can identify, using that and soils and all kinds of factors, and identify areas where you could actually build a wetland and it would be successful. If you want to build a wetland in an area that's never been a wetland, it doesn't do nearly as well as if you build one where a wetland wants to be.
Right, yeah.
That's an interesting theory, though. I always thought that wetlands were just a simple byproduct of nature, and I didn't realize that you could reconstruct a wetland, so to speak.
It has a lot more to do than just having water on the soil. There's a lot of certain kind of plant species, a certain type of soil that's conducive to having a wetland. If you have a real sandy area, it's probably not a good spot for a wetland because it's not going to stay wet without forcing it to. But those species that thrive in that wetland environment probably aren't going to thrive very well. And
let's get back to your background of being an engineer, Darren. When in my way back in the Conestoga wagon days when I was on the college campus, you could tell all the engineering students because they walked around with slipsticks on their belts. And for the benefit of those who don't know what a slipstick was, that was a special architectural device that you guys carried. All of them, all the engineers. You knew who was in engineering.
Yep.
Give us a little bit about your background and how you, what it took to become a licensed civil engineer.
In high school, definitely took all the math and science classes I could, but really, I think that engineering today is more about meeting the federal regulations. You have to. There's a baseline. You have to know how the strength of materials, and you have to know how to do trigonometry and geometry and those sorts of things. But we have to in college take a lot of calculus courses and stuff like that. But really, very seldom do we use a lot of that information in what we do on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes, but not very often. A lot of it is about your ability to communicate with people who aren't engineers and explain the need to do the activities that we do, or the ability to know the laws. So there's a lot more to engineering than just that. As far as my background, I went following my graduation. I grew up over in Pike County, Illinois, which is in western Illinois, just an hour south of Quincy, Illinois, and then went to the University of Illinois over at Urbana-Champaign and got my bachelor's degree. And then I spent another year of coursework following receipt of the bachelor's degree down at the Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. At the time, that was the only university in the state that offered enough credit hours that would allow me to become a professional land surveyor, because an education requirement had been implemented by that time. So then I got out and I went to work for a large company in Springfield, Hanson Professional Services, probably the largest engineering firm in downstate Illinois, and worked out of there and worked my way up to a project manager, and I was the survey manager for the company. To become a professional engineer or professional land surveyor, for that matter, in Illinois today, you have to have a minimum of a bachelor's degree. For an engineering, it has to be an engineering degree. For land surveying, it has to be in land surveying or what they call a related science. Related science could be forestry. It could be engineering, which is what mine was in. It could be biology. There's just some requirements as to how much math you have and how much of each of the hard sciences you have in order to get the so once you have that degree, then you go out and you have to go to work. First you have to take a test, and it's an entry-level intern test. So for either of those occupations,
pretty stringent test.
It is it's an all-day test, an 8-hour test, and it's called for engineering, it's called the engineering or the fundamentals of engineering exam, and that doesn't allow you to be a professional engineer in any way, shape, or form. It's just that you get then the right to work as an engineering intern under another professional engineer. And following that, you have to intern for 4 years under a licensed professional engineer and be in responsible charge. So you have to be doing your projects. That person reviews them, says yes, this is okay, and learn about the profession. And then following that, you can take a second all-day exam called the Principles and Practice exam, and after that you get your professional engineer's license. And it's very similar for land surveying.
Yes, I noted that Lisa also is an engineer. Are there many ladies professional in this profession?
It's becoming more common than it was at the time that Lisa and I went through college. It was very rare, and probably the time you guys would have been there, it would have been even rarer.
Oh, yeah.
I would say that when we were in college, it was 5% or so of the college population were female engineers.
That's not a very big percentage.
No.
Surveying in Logan County goes back to 1822 through 24.
Absolutely.
What kind of surveying were they do? Like to find Mr. Scully's boundaries, or what?
Well, the original surveys that the government then, much as it now, needed money, and the way they were raising money is they were selling land, and it was all fresh land out here. So they established what they called the Government Land Office, and they hired surveyors to go out and divide up into what everybody's familiar with now, the sections and townships. So they went out and they laid out the original surveys of those sections and townships, and those started here in Logan County in the 1820s. So
now, what is that post that they would put in the ground that would be the marker from which they would measure?
Yep, they typically set, it depends on where you are and what materials are readily available, but they would set wooden posts in the ground a lot of times when they went and did the surveys. And so they would measure, they actually had a compass, and they had chainmen. And it was a large party back then, because it was virgin territory, and they had to cut through timber, or if they came to a river, they had to get across it and keep going, and they had people sighting along the line. So they'd have 8 or 10 people in these parties clearing line and pulling the chain and sighting the compass and taking notes and cooking food for the whole party. There's no community in most places. There's no support. You're out there on the frontier. A lot of times they would, there's talks of meetings with Indians as they're out doing these sorts of things.
Probably for better or worse. Huh?
Absolutely. Just a quick aside, what's the length of a chain?
a chain. Most of the chains they carried were actually 33 feet long. A chain is actually 66 feet. Is what it's. Yeah, it was actually, they called it a Gunther's chain at the time, and it was actually links. They were,
like real chain,
like a real chain.
Yeah,
and they would every time they were back in civilization, they'd travel to St. Louis. They would compare it to a actual, standard measurement, and they could adjust that chain. So as they went, it wasn't a very precise business back then. Although some were better than others, but they're pulling on these chains and trying to get accurate measurements, and it stretched over time. It was metallic.
Well, who decided 33 and 66 feet and why?
Well, a mile is
5,280
feet. If you divide it into 80 even pieces, the decision actually, I guess to answer your question directly, went back to Thomas Jefferson, I believe, was working on the ideal size of a plot of land to support a community, and that's where they came up with the idea of a township. And the surveys, the rectangular system, as this is known, where you divide land up into sections and townships, was developed in Ohio. That was really the first area, and it was the experimental. So they have lots of different ways. Around here, a township, by the time they got here, things were pretty settled on how they were doing the surveys. But in Ohio, sometimes they were 10 miles square instead of 6 miles square for a township. They're numbered differently. They had different size sections within them. They did lots of odd things, but they were experimenting on what worked out the best, and they were looking at what people wanted to buy, because ultimately they were less concerned with accuracy than they were just dividing up the ground that the government owned and selling it to make money.
Sure.
They had to pay off the national debt.
Things don't change, do
they?
They
don't change.
Not so much.
I'm thinking they wish they had some more territory to sell off right now.
Yeah, really. And Abraham Lincoln was a surveyor.
Absolutely. Abraham Lincoln was a surveyor. He did a lot of surveys in this area. He surveyed the original town of Petersburg, laid it out. He surveyed their post road through Middletown. He performed several surveys in what's now Logan County. Of course, at the time he was surveying, it was not Logan County. It was Sangamon County, Menard, Mason. It was all Sangamo County at the time. But
you have a lot of projects, excuse me, please, that relate to Illinois Department of Transportation.
Sure do.
And that is, they have probably a palette of different areas for you to be assigned to work. How far do you go geographically here, Darren?
Oh, we do work throughout Illinois and even in other states.
Oh, do you?
Yeah, we not just for the Illinois Department of Transportation, but for other clients. For example, we've done some streetscape design down in Palestine, Illinois, which is the oldest town in Illinois, down in Crawford County, down in southeastern Illinois. We do work at the Metropolis, Illinois Airport. We're doing work for the Illinois Tollway up in Chicago. We've done work previously in Iowa and Missouri. We're limited by licensure. I personally am licensed in Illinois, Missouri, Wisconsin, and North Dakota.
You are?
Yes.
Now, in Palestine, when you do work there, you're probably not the first engineer to have worked in that area since it was the oldest town. Do you find that as you go back through history in a place like that, or even Logan County, since we go back a long ways, the original surveys that were done are still pretty accurate today?
I'm not sure accurate is the right word, but essentially where the original surveyor set the stake, that's where it's at. So we have a thing in surveying where you follow in the footsteps of the previous surveyor. Most of the sections we go out and survey here, or really southern Illinois is probably worse, but they vary greatly. We'd say nominally they're a mile, and that was their intent, to stake out a mile square. But I've seen them as wide as 8,000 or 9,000 feet and as narrow as, a couple hundred feet. When the couple hundred feet was a without going into too many details, the state of Illinois is governed by what they call principal meridians. And you may see in a plat book where it's this section, this township and range of the third principal meridian in this area.
Yeah.
Essentially, the principal meridian was established. They picked a point at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi River, set a point, and went due north and just started staking every mile. So that's how the principal, and the eastern border of Logan County is the third principal meridian.
Well, they had to start someplace, I suppose.
Actually, the initial point, they also set a baseline which governed north or south, and that was it's around Centralia is where the initial point was established, because southern Illinois was much more populated than this area of Illinois at the time. Those early surveys were 1810, something like in that neighborhood is when they were establishing.
A boundary survey. What is a boundary survey, sir? A
boundary survey is where we go out and we look for evidence. A lot of people will call up, like you had mentioned, and say, hey, I need to know where my line is. I want to build a fence, or my neighbor's over on my, their driveway's over in my property, and I need to know where my line is. So we go out and what we do is we look at the evidence left in the field by the previous surveyors, and we look at any records left by those surveyors. Logan County has really been blessed by a lot of the previous county engineers here were actually land surveyors, and they left their records behind for the public. And they're all publicly available, so we can go and pull those records and look and see what surveys have been done, and we go out and find the monuments they left and verify, this is their monument, or reset their monument, and we go and we essentially analyze the evidence that we found. And surveyors don't always agree. It's an opinion. A boundary survey is our personal opinion of the location of your boundary line per your deed. So sometimes, depending on the evidence that each surveyor has found, some surveyors may have records that other surveyors don't, may have more information other surveyors don't. Sometimes they just disagree on procedures and methodology. So there are differences amongst the surveyors out there.
Well, as Lincoln, Illinois came into existence and time moved along, we have East Lincoln and West Lincoln Township. Now, West Lincoln runs straight with the world, square with the world. East Lincoln runs square with the railroad tracks. Do you find that a lot in a community? That right in the middle of town you change the whole thing?
It's not totally irregular, and that came about because of the two communities. Postville was the original community, and it was laid out in accordance with the section lines at the time. Or actually, it predated the section. Postville was there before the original government surveys really came out right about the same time. So there was essentially a tavern there, a small community, if you will, before the original surveys came through. But when they came through and when they subdivided, I believe the first one may have been Birdknapp and Tinsley's edition, but that was when Logan County was founded or was broken off of Sangamon County. They were land developers in Postville, and they said, we will donate land for a courthouse for the county. And they developed a subdivision around it, and I mean their intent was, that's going to be valuable land now, I can sell lots. And that's some of the original subdivision surveys of the county are over there in Postville.
I bet that kind of thinking went on in a lot of communities.
Absolutely.
So I'll give you some land and then. Well,
even the railroad, which has been very important in Lincoln's history and why Lincoln is at 45 degrees to north-south world, the Illinois Central Railroad, when they came through, they were granted land on either side of the railroad, and they were the ones who helped sell and develop that. So,
how about just plain people? Like he and I happen to live next door. We're very plain. Happen to live next door to one another, and how important is it that we know what our lot is? I personally think it's pretty important. Of course, I get involved in a lot of the situations where people didn't figure out where their lot was and deal with the problems, so I see a lot of those problems. I think it's always a good idea to do your best to locate those, or have someone locate your property corner, at least take a quick look, if not a full survey, on
have a smaller lot in town and the house is, you don't know exactly where the line is. Your house may be right up against the line, and you have ideas. You want to build a porch on this side. We run into that all the time. People will, the realtor said the line was over here, and it's apparent there's an old fence over here, but that may not be where the line is. That could have been their fence, and they own, the neighbor owns another 5 feet on your side of that fence. You
basically,
really don't know.
we're just talking about meets, what they call meets and bounds at this point in time. What about structural engineering? Do you also get involved in structural engineering, Mr. Forgy?
We assist. We are not structural engineers at Prairie Engineers. We have no one with that licensure
to do that.
But we do. We recently completed a small bridge design for Logan County. My wife has some experience with structure. She actually went to school to be a structural engineer. She just never obtained the license as a structural engineer. She just
she's pretty moxie
up until recently, you could do some small bridge design without that structural engineering certification. Some what they call standard bridges, but they don't allow that anymore. But we assist a lot of structural engineers, or in a lot of cases we'll bring them into our project, because really more than half of a bridge project is typically done by a professional engineer. You have to analyze the flow of the stream you're going over. If it crosses a stream, you have to, usually there's adjustments to the roadway location or elevation. There's a lot of work that goes into a bridge project. Surveys, they have to survey where the bridge is now and the roads approaching it and where the property lines or right-of-way lines are. So more than half of a project is typically not bridge design.
Darren, we appreciate your time this morning. Darren has agreed to, we have a public announcement, a guest here very, very shortly, and we're going to take a quick commercial break. But before we do, I want to, Judy and I both want to thank you, Darren, for coming up here, spending this time with us this morning. We could probably talk a lot, well, I know I could, a lot longer on this subject, because I remember my 8th grade math. A lady named Maddie Anderson taught me about surveying in a very cursory way. You use terms that I hadn't forgotten in all those years. So we appreciate your being with us. And do you have anything that you would like to remark before we close this morning?
Not really. I just want to thank you both for having me here, and I appreciate the opportunity.
That's been most interesting. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Darren. Darren Forgy, Prairie Engineers. We appreciate your being with us, sir.
Thanks.
And right back live in the studios here, WLCN. Program is Viewpoint 96.3, 648-5510. In case somebody would like to call and make a comment or have a question. We have a very important, we're kind of coming along in perhaps a public service part of the program this morning. Dr. Jason Wrage, a young feller from off of Scully Prairie from way back, is associated with Best Friends Animal Hospital. And they wanted to talk about a little problem that's going on in the county. Go ahead, Dr. Wrage.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, we were just here to do a little public service announcement. Recently at the vet clinic in Lincoln there, we have had multiple cases, up to 10, of an infection called parvovirus. And it's nasty. It's very nasty, yes. And it's a very contagious virus that it is extremely easy to transmit between animals, and any dog that has not been vaccinated is highly susceptible to to pretty severe conditions.
If you take your dog, though, once a year to get the shots, the battery of shots, would he be quite protected?
Yes, that's correct. Yep. Any dog that's up to date on vaccines, and the general rule of thumb for puppies starting at 6 weeks of age to 8 weeks of age, we want 3 consecutive booster vaccines, and then after that an annual vaccine will be sufficient.
What would be the symptoms that Mr. and Mrs. homeowner would, or pet owner, would notice with a dog that might be an alert to them?
Sure. Generally, to start out with, most of the dogs we see are just kind of off sick, look like they might have a cold, and that quickly progresses to episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. And the concern with the disease is not so much that the virus itself has a severe effect on the dog as far as causing fatality, but the corresponding dehydration tends to be the most severe problem, especially affecting the smaller puppies, smaller dogs.
Yeah, well, I've danced that dance as a pet owner, and I know what that's a little bit. It's a pretty serious thing. It's not pretty. It's a very serious thing.
It is very serious. Correct.
How is it transmitted from dog to dog? And it doesn't go to other species, right?
Correct. Parvovirus if this disease is specifically a canine virus, there's similar families and other species, including cats and other animals, but specifically for the infection we're dealing with is specifically for dogs. And it's transmitted, the general rule of thumb is a fecal-oral route. Dogs out at a park or something comes in contact with an infected dog's either mucus or feces, and that's how it's picked up. The interesting thing about parvovirus, it's what's called a DNA virus, which means it doesn't change its structure very often, so the vaccine's very effective, but it is also very tough. And so because it's a non-enveloped virus, it can survive inside the house for up to 2 months.
Wow.
And then outdoors, if it's in a fecal material and dirt, organic matter, there's been reports of up to a year survival time.
Oh, boy.
Now, what if I brought my angel came through that door with the symptoms of parvo? What would you do, sir?
Well, the first thing we do, especially right now, is any dog with any clinical signs at all gets an in-house snap test that's very sensitive. It takes about 10 minutes, and we can detect whether or not that dog actually has parvo, which is a newer development as far as tests go, but is very useful because it allows us to kind of determine our course of treatment. If the dog's extremely ill, oftentimes they require being kept at the hospital, placing IVs, continuous IV fluids. The other thing we have to do for these guys is isolation. We keep them in a separate area of the clinic. We have bleached foot baths to walk through. We have to disinfect. We're constantly mopping everything because it is such a contagious disease.
What happens if we go out to a Chade with a dog and we don't really know, and all of a sudden, while the dog's being boarded there, these symptoms come about? What would happen within any boarding facility such as Chade?
Well, I'm fairly certain that Chade requires vaccines for dogs, so I would say that that's one of the reasons that a place should do that, is because not necessarily protecting your dog, but protecting everybody else's dog. And so if it does experience some situation like that, certainly they can bring it over to the clinic. We can take a look at it, make sure, do that test that we discussed, that ELISA test.
Is it a blood test?
It's actually, we take a little sample of the feces and put it in
it's a stool test.
Yeah, it's a stool sample test, if you will. So, and it, like I said, it takes 10 minutes in the clinic there, and it's very sensitive. It does a very nice job, and it allows us to help kind of distinguish between a dog that might have gotten into the Thanksgiving turkey and has some GI upset versus the dog on the other side that might have, clinical signs of parvovirus. So it's very useful for that.
What do you do about the dehydration?
That would be where when we keep them in the hospital, we place an IV catheter in the vein and provide them with IV fluids until they can recover from the virus.
Physically, is that a little bit of a difficult thing to put an IV in a small animal like that?
The main challenge.
Does it stay? How
does
one do that?
There's the two biggest challenges are these dogs typically are dehydrated, so their blood pressure may be way down, and it's difficult to get the IV in the vein. And then the other thing is, once they start feeling a little bit better, dogs will be dogs, and a certain percentage, especially those that are puppies, are going to want to chew that catheter out because they don't think it belongs there.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I can't imagine Murphy being very welcoming of a needle in his arm or leg.
Certainly some dogs are a little more acceptable than others, that's for sure.
Is there, I'm trying to think of the way to describe how a dog owner, a pet owner, would realize that we've got a problem here. They first notice listlessness in the dog.
Certainly.
Perhaps, obviously, if there's a problem, if we have stool problems.
Right, yeah, certainly the vomiting and diarrhea are often the presenting complaints, but when you just talk with an owner, they'll say, well, Murphy didn't eat last night. He's kind of just been hiding by himself. We thought he felt like he had a temperature. A dog's normal temperature, rectal temperature, should be 101.5. And so if it starts to rise quite a bit higher than that, that can be an indication that that we may have a sick dog on our hands. So
now, this can be fatal, or will be fatal, if left unchecked.
That's correct. It's highly fatal in dogs that aren't treated, that have never had a vaccine, and it can be fatal to a certain percentage of dogs regardless of the treatment. There's also Tamiflu, if you're familiar with that, is a human flu viral antigen treatment, and that actually has been used some, but there's debate because the receptors that are in the parvovirus are different than the human flu virus.
Yeah.
But some evidence has shown that that might be useful, so that is an option to treat with. But the main thing is supportive care, and I can tell you that you can see, you know, as dogs that have been vaccinated at least once are going to do a little bit better than dogs that have never had a vaccine, and dogs that have multiple vaccines almost never come down with the disease at all.
Is there a difference between the size of the dog, such as Murphy or Angel, or a pretty good sized Labrador?
Jim has big dogs.
Yes, Jim has big dogs.
The main difference is obviously the volume of the size of the dog, the volume of the bloodstream that can relate to how quickly they become dehydrated. So, for instance, you know, a larger dog has a little more reserve than a smaller dog, obviously, and they can maintain a body temperature as well. But typically, the differences you see in dogs are more of, there's been some evidence that certain breeds, including Rottweilers, Dobermans, and German Shepherds, for whatever reason, have been reported to be more sensitive to the disease.
Oh, really? Now, you talked about puppies. It sounds like this would kind of remind you of distemper that puppies get. So it would be necessary to do the test you're talking about in order to rule out the fact that it was distemper.
Certainly, it presents like multiple other things. Puppies, being puppies, often get into things and eat things they shouldn't, and so they could experience some transient vomiting or diarrhea with or without a temperature. They can get a bacterial infection as well. And so the other concern that we do have, and that you run into oftentimes if a dog has not been vaccinated, is that they may not have been dewormed as well. So not only do you have this virus that's causing some major issues in the GI tract, but you may also have intestinal parasites present, which can just exacerbate the situation.
They can be born with those worms.
The worms can be transmitted in utero in some instances.
But the bottom line is that the reason the doctors appeared here this morning, kind of more of a public relations thing, or make us aware. You have noticed more of this at the Best Friends Animal Clinic. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct. In the last week, like I said, we've had, I think, at least 10 positive tests compared to maybe 1 the previous year. And
so that means that we have something out there.
We have an outbreak right now going on, and we're seeing that. And our hope is that people can limit if they have unvaccinated dogs, limit your exposure to public areas where other dogs might be, and then get your dogs vaccinated as soon as possible if they haven't been, to hopefully help ward that off. Now, it does take approximately 3 weeks for an immune system to build response to a vaccine, so don't consider your dog protected the instant you get the vaccine, but just encourage people to be cautious. If you do think you have it, or if you've had a dog with it, bleach is really the best disinfectant, and cleaning everything as best possible.
Go ahead, Judith.
It's very scary. The first case of parvo that I ever saw was Bill's poor dog, and he ran such a high fever he got retarded, didn't he?
That dog is retarded before he got that fever.
Maybe so, but it is a scary thing. So really, it would serve you well if you have a pet and haven't been judicious about the vaccinations to hustle out and get one now.
It would be wise to, see your veterinarian and have them vaccinated, as soon as possible. Now, if your dog is sick, we tend not to encourage the vaccine at that very time, but watching them closely, and as soon as they're doing well, to get them vaccinated with your veterinarian.
Yeah, right.
Well, we appreciate, by the way, this is one of our local kids, so to speak, here. Just real quickly, your professional background, sir? And
Yeah,
then we will ring off.
So I'm a Hartsburg-Emden graduate, and then after completing high school there, I went to the University of Illinois. I did a undergraduate degree in animal sciences, and then did my veterinary degree at the University of Illinois as well. In 2007, I graduated. I've been practicing in the field since then for 5 years in Roseville, Illinois, at a mixed animal practice, and then 1 year down at a small animal practice in Edwardsville before I got the opportunity to return back to my old stomping grounds, and been at Greenhaven / Best Friends for 2 years now, and been really enjoying being back in the area.
Good. And do you do large animals now too?
We do. The Greenhaven Clinic services all species, so we do have farm calls and vet trucks that we make farm calls, and also an in-house facility as well.
Right.
Veterinarians making house calls today, is that almost a lost art, Doctor?
Well, there's certainly few of us out there. There's fewer every year. And so, just like every industry, the livestock industry changes. So there's different needs in different places that we can be useful. So we still exist, but definitely not as common as even 20 years ago.
But you can't bring your cow to a doctor's appointment, for crying out loud.
Well, we actually have a facility at the clinic at Greenhaven where people can load a cow up on the trailer, bring them in, and we have some chutes. We have some stalls where we can keep cattle and or horses or goats for that matter. So people do bring their animals into us. We also do go out on the farm as well.
Well, golly.
We appreciate very much your coming with us, Dr. Jason Wrage. Nice to have you back in town.
Thank you.
The old saying, it's nice to have you back where you belong.
Yes.
Hello, Dolly. In any event, we wanted to alert the listeners to the fact that there apparently, or ostensibly, is a parvo problem going around in our county, and Best Friends Animal Clinic wanted to be sure and alert pet owners about that. So we thank you very much, Dr. Jason Wrage.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, James.